You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. This week on the show, we're taking a look at the overall idea of wildlife management in the state of Mississippi. It's a pretty big idea, right? I'm talking with someone who looks at that every day. He is Chief of Wildlife, Russ Walsh.
This episode of the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast is brought to you by the Foundation for Mississippi Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks.
You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. And we are talking this week with the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks Chief of Wildlife. He is Russ Walsh with us here today. Russ, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah, so you are a long-time Mississippian. It goes way back to, we were discussing this, Amite County,
That's right?
Did I say it right?
If you're from down there, it's either Amite or Amite County. That's right.
I was there recently in Liberty and went to the Amite County Courthouse. But what I really wanted to see was the Rexall drugs across the street where Jerry Clower's coffee mug's still hanging in the cafe.
Yeah. So if you're from Amite County, at some point in the conversation with somebody, Jerry Clower is going to come up. So my family actually knew him and his brother very well. So you can't be from Amite County and not have some Jerry Clower connection.
Right. And now they got big signs on the road and everything, Jerry Clower Highway and everything else.
The funny thing is, my grandfather actually owned a general store in Liberty for a long time, so not far from where you're talking about.
Yeah, is that right? Yeah. So your family goes way back with the Clowers.
Been there a long time, yeah. So.
Well, then the natural progression, Russ, would be, should we talk first about coon hunting? I mean, man, I don't know if we ought to start there or not, but since we started with Jerry Clower. Let's jump right in. Chief of Wildlife.
Yeah.
If someone were to walk up to you and say, hey, so I see the title, what does that mean? What do you do? How do you answer that?
It's a tough one to answer, and it depends on how much time you have. I like to tell people that to me, this is a dream job. It's the greatest job to me in the world. I work for, to me, the greatest agency with some of the greatest people. And it really would take a long time to explain all of what we do. But the people that work in this bureau, the people that work for this agency, are second to none. I'd put them up against anybody in the country. And on any given day, we're doing all sorts of things. If you go through a year's time, it would take a long time to tell you all of what we do.
Sure. Well, obviously, a big, long list of things that fall under the umbrella in the wildlife agency. But people, what kind of size staff are we looking at in your department in the state of Mississippi?
Yeah, so we have the most staff now in the Wildlife Bureau. A lot of people, when you first start talking about the agency, you usually want to make it clear that we're talking about, we have law enforcement. Everybody recognizes the agency as game wardens.
Right.
But there's a lot more to it than that. So you have the Fisheries Bureau and Wildlife Bureau and state parks. So within the Wildlife Bureau, we have about 90 staff. And that's folks that work on our wildlife management areas. That's folks that work with our species programs, turkey, deer, alligator, which you've already done podcasts with some of those folks. And then we have folks that are, kind of our jack of all trades, where they're regional wildlife biologists. And those guys and gals get to wake up every day not knowing what they might be doing. Mm-hmm. So something different every day. So we kind of run the gamut. But we have a good staff. 90 doesn't sound like a lot. But if you look at the history of the agency, that's the most we've ever had. So we're pretty proud of that and proud of the men and women that we have.
Sure. So you got 82 counties in Mississippi, and those 90. How does that sort of place on the map of those 82 counties in terms of where people are?
Yeah. So we touch all regions of the state, and we may have a few more folks in one region than the other, but some of those folks, again, are tied to our wildlife management areas, and those are scattered, literally from the Tennessee line, all the way to the coast. And then we have private land staff who do nothing but work with our private landowners, and they're scattered across the state. So although we may not have somebody in all 82 counties, we do touch all regions of the state, north to south, east to west.
And as I was kind of reading a little bit about your history, private lands and wildlife management, that's been a big part of sort of your career path, hasn't it? Tell me just a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the private lands is where I cut my teeth. So when I, both of us being MSU grads, when I was in junior college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I came to Super Bulldog weekend, and I was walking around the drill field, and I walked by the MSU, the College of Forest Resources tent, and I met a guy there, and we were talking about what the College of Forest Resources was and careers, or degrees and careers. And a guy was talking to me about being a wildlife biologist. And it snapped. I said, that's exactly what I want to do. And I went home, told my parents, hey, I'm headed to MSU. And so I went to graduate school. And when I got out of grad school, I was looking for a job. And I was very fortunate to get hired on with MDWFP. So it was kind of a dream come true to come back home to Mississippi and contribute to, what really was, molded and shaped me was spending time in the outdoors. So now I was going to be able to give back to that. And when I started my career here, that's what I started out doing, was primarily private lands work. And we didn't really have a dedicated group of folks that worked strictly with private lands. That kind of started in the mid-2000s. And so I was kind of one of the first that was solely dedicated to doing private lands work and working with private landowners. And being in South Mississippi, where I was at the time, I was doing a lot of prescribed fire work, a lot of along the pine restoration work. So that's where I cut my teeth as a professional, was on private lands, and saw the importance of it. 80% of our state is privately owned. So, as an agency, dedicating our time and effort to helping those private landowners is very, very important. So, yeah, I spent a lot of my career working there. So,
what would be, or is there a difference? And if so, what would be the difference in terms of an approach from the Wildlife Bureau perspective of, wildlife management in public areas versus what it's like in working with that in the private lands area, 80% of the state being private? How do those two approaches differ?
Yeah, so with public lands and our primarily our wildlife management areas, there's several things. One, we know we need to provide opportunity for folks to either go hunt or fish or bird watch or hike or whatever. Those public lands matter, from that standpoint, providing that opportunity for people that want to go there for whatever purpose they want to go. But also, depending on that WMA, we want that WMA to be a model for managing that particular ecosystem. We have WMAs that are in the native prairies, they're in the bottomland hardwoods, upland pines. So our goal is to try to manage those WMAs in a manner that's consistent with that ecosystem, whether it's using prescribed fire or whatever it may be. We want somebody to go look at that WMA and say, what, I'd like to model my private lands after this WMA. So that's our part of our goal. But and we want to manage those WMAs for some, in some cases we may want to shift our management a little more focused to bobwhite quail or maybe wild turkeys. Deer everywhere, obviously, but some WMAs may be more conducive for managing for certain species. But when it comes to private lands, we don't have control over those or purview over those like we do our wildlife management areas. Mm-hmm. So our goal there is we want to help those private landowners become, managers. We want them to be able to manage that property for the species that they care about. With 80% of the land base being private lands, wildlife conservation is going to happen primarily on the private lands. We can't do it all on public lands. We've got to have those private landowners engaged. So we have staff dedicated across the state to going out and visiting with those landowners and helping educate landowners and getting them moving down the road to managing their property to where it benefits wildlife. And ultimately, we want them to become managers. So that's really our approach, is we want to get hands-on with those landowners and again, help them meet their objectives, but ultimately we want their land to benefit wildlife the way our public lands are.
So there's obviously a trust factor then, that's got to be a part of that, right? So the landowner obviously has to trust you,
sure,
and a little bit of vice versa, in order to, if this is the right term, take advice or heed advice.
Sure.
And I wouldn't think that comes overnight. I mean, there's got to be a period of time for the individuals that you and those that work in the department building those relationships with landowners so that there is some trust there.
That's right. And I couldn't tell you how many land visits I went on where people would say, I didn't know y'all did this. And, for a number of years, we didn't necessarily in that capacity, but we've been working with private landowners with DMAP, for a long time. But actually, riding around a property and talking about management and really getting down into the weeds, no pun intended, and nitty gritty with landowners. That wasn't a dedicated service that we provided. And so when we started having a dedicated private lands program, and those landowners, we did those site visits, and it was word of mouth. They would talk to their buddy who had land and say, hey, I did a site visit with Department of Wildlife, and man, they told me all this good stuff. So we started getting a lot of word of mouth contacts. But yeah, there is that level of trust there. And that's why I go back and brag on our staff. It's a tremendous group of men and women who do have a lot of knowledge, and they're constantly sharpening their iron, if you will. And so the knowledge that they have and the work that they do, I think in some cases it speaks for itself now, because again, landowners are picking up the phone and calling their buddies and saying, hey, you want to manage your place for turkeys, call Department of Wildlife or call this particular biologist.
Mm-hmm. So it's like, if you know what you're doing, it's going to work out generally if you have some success.
That's right.
Kind of like the restaurant business. If the food's good,
that's right. People are going to go.
They're going to go. You can stay open. You mentioned quail. I think that's maybe one subject that hasn't yet been covered here on the podcast, at least chronologically in the way we've done the interviews. So big, broad question. What is the status sort of quail hunting and that species in the state of Mississippi right now, 2024?
Yeah, it's such a fascinating history with bobwhite quail and quail hunting. If you go back and look at the South, and you look at quail hunting is just our history is steeped in the quail culture and steeped in quail hunting. I grew up around some old time bird hunters, and so always kind of was a little bit of a part of me, because I grew up around some of those old folks. And I was fortunate enough to do my graduate research on bobwhite, so I've kind of had a connection to quail, for a long time. But in today's world, we hear a lot of folks talk about the good old days, and there were some good old days. Moving, multiple coveys in an hour. That they certainly were the good days, and those days are not here anymore. But it's not all gloom and doom for bobwhites. There's a lot of great work that's gone on over the last several decades with bobwhites. There's dedicated groups that do nothing but work, for bobwhites. There's been a whole lot of funding put on the landscape for bobwhites. So they're holding their own. Is it like the 30s and 40s? No. But if you're a bird hunter today and you've got a bird dog and you want to go out and hunt some places and find some coveys, you can do that. And I think the more, just like talking about private landowners, the more we do work on the landscape, the more we get fire on the landscape. I think quail are they're going to do better, and it's not all doom and gloom. And you're seeing more of an interest today among younger generations. I've got a bird dog myself, and I don't get to bird hunt near what I would like to or what I would want to. But for some of the younger generations today, that's starting to kind of come back around, and you see some younger generations getting a bird dog and going out and bird hunting. And in the wintertime now, you can hunt woodcock along with quail. So it's not, if you're not moving any coveys, you may find some woodcock. So it's a good way to fill up a day.
Yeah. Can a private landowner, just up and decide, that's what I want. That's what I want. I want to be able to quail hunt on my property. Is it as simple as setting your mind on it and working with you, and you can figure out a way to make it happen? Or is it not necessarily make a decision, you can make it happen, and sort of the geography does depend on where you are?
Yeah, a lot of it is geography. If we're in the middle of the South Delta in a bottomland hardwood situation, you gotta certainly recognize where you are geographically. But outside of the Delta, anywhere in the rest of Mississippi, there's tempering expectations. Yeah, if I'm a 40-acre landowner and I want to manage for bobwhites, can I? Absolutely, you can. But you've got to recognize what the landscape around you is, and there's going to be some limitations. But for some cases, for quail, it almost is, if you build it, they'll come. We've seen a place that they have done a timber cut or done a prescribed burn, and quail just show up. You don't know where they came from. They just show up there. So it's kind of amazing how they find places where the habitat is starting to be manipulated or managed in some way for bobwhites. So if you're a landowner and you want to manage for bobwhites, or you want to go quail hunting, Can you do it? Absolutely. But again, that's part of our work with you. We want to help you do that, but we want to also manage your expectations. But if you're having success, your landowner next to you may say, "Hey, I see something's working there. I want to do that." And I can't tell you how many people we followed up with or have called us and said, "Hey, look, I'm here in Quail where I haven't heard them in 20 years." And that's always amazing to hear, and it's exciting because something's working.
Sure. So. Give me a little history lesson too. What did happen? You mentioned 20s and 30s. Yeah. It's not like it was. What happened?
Yeah, that's part of that fascinating history of Bob Wyatt. So if you look at post Civil War, when we started really rebuilding a nation, if you will, and we started building navies and started building towns back and all of that stuff. Of course, we started lumber was a big deal for other countries as well. The logging boom of the South. If you look at longleaf pine, it covered over 90 million acres at one time, in the South, and it makes fantastic lumber. Not to mention, the naval stores needed the pitch and the pine tar for building these navies and building these ports and all that stuff. So the logging boom started in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So you started seeing a landscape change, and then prescribed fire started to really go by the wayside. Smokey Bear came along, and others came along, and so you really just started seeing a cultural change and a landscape change, and the small patchwork farming. We started doing more broad scale farming, and so all of those things were working in concert, kind of working against the Bob Wyatt. And of course, a lot of people want to blame fire ants and predators, and certainly that may play a factor in it. But you look at the whole scale landscape change across the Southeast from the late 1800s all the way through the 1960s, 70s. And then we started seeing the fast rotation pine culture and what that did. So really it's a broad scale landscape change that was exacerbated by things like fire ants and predators and those things. Mm-hmm. So our landscape just didn't look like it did back in those days when it was really conducive for Bob Wyatt.
So it's primarily a habitat deal.
Yeah, it's primarily habitat.
How about that? So an even broader question for the chief of the Wildlife Bureau, the future of wildlife in Mississippi, what does that look like?
Wow.
I know, that's about as broad as it gets.
Yeah, there's so much to that. And one of the first things that I would say, and we talk a lot about this with partners and meetings that we're in, a big part of that is, and this is certainly not exclusive, but one of those is invasive species, whether that's, critters or whether that's plants. But invasive species are a huge, huge part of our future in managing wildlife. You think things like, wild pigs, and the havoc that they're wreaking on our landscape. We still don't have a really good understanding of what they may be doing to some of the wildlife species, direct interaction, direct, conflict, competition for resources or direct predation, all these. We don't really have our heads wrapped around it, just what kind of impact pigs may be having. Then you look at, the actual plant species, things like Kogan grass and Chinese privet and Chinese tallow and all of those things that are really wreaking havoc on our native ecosystems. So a big part of wildlife conservation in the future is getting our heads wrapped around just what invasive species are doing on the landscape and what we're going to do about them. But I think the other part is, looking at, we go back to private lands, go back to land management, that's changing, society is changing, and folks passing down land from one generation to the next. You're seeing that change, and you're seeing people not directly connected to the land anymore. We talk a lot about getting kids in the outdoors because there's so much more that takes their time and attention these days. And so, how do we keep people engaged in hunting and fishing? How do we keep people connected to the land so that they do have that connection to their homestead, and they want to manage it for wildlife, and they want to manage it for their kids? They want to keep we want them to keep, prescribed burning, and want to keep managing timber, or whatever it is that's important for those critters that we love. That's important, keeping that connection to the land base. But as an agency that is funded by hunting and fishing licenses, we've got to keep people connected to the land and connected to hunting and fishing, because they ultimately are the ones that pay for conservation. So there's a lot of challenges, but certainly it's not something that we shy away from, or we just say, it's not any sense in trying. We can rise to the challenge, because if you look at the history of conservation over the last 100 years, and you look at some of the challenges that we faced, deer and turkeys were near extirpated from the state. Mm-hmm. Alligators were on the endangered species list in 1987, and now we're hunting them. Yeah. There's a lot of success that we've had as an agency and as hunters and as a conservation community. So the challenges that I'm talking about, we've risen to challenges before, and we'll rise to these challenges. But we do have them. Disease management, things like CWD, which I'm sure you talked about when you talked with William and others, the disease management challenge. So there's a lot out there. But again, I'm going to go back to the staff that we have. They're ready to rise to the challenge, and we'll do that in concert with the men and women that hunt and fish and the landowners. We'll meet those challenges. You hear, or I do, another sort of relationship element. We talked about building trust, relationship with landowners, but you mentioned those kids and future generations. Yeah. That really is the guts of what it's all about. That's anyway, right. Isn't it? And investing in them and getting kids on the bank with a fishing rod in their hand, or getting them in a stand and getting them in the woods. That education process and introductory process has to be a huge part of it, doesn't it? Right. And you think about, folks like us, my dad took me hunting and fishing, and with my brother, and, some of my fondest memories are, the small hunting camp we grew up in. It was the three of us and my two cousins, and that was it. We grew up hunting a small track in Amite County. Yeah. And so much of who I am today was built around those experiences hunting and fishing. You're likely not sitting here right now. Absolutely not. If he doesn't take you hunting, absolutely fishing. Not, no question. And so, I never thought about it as a career. It was just, I was going to hunt and fish. That's just what I did. But being able to have a career in something that I love doing, and again, was molded me as a kid, was just, I almost couldn't conceive it that I could actually make a living doing this. But yeah, absolutely. Those next generations, getting those kids involved. And I have three of my own, and I talk to my wife about it all the time. I don't want to be, my kid's grown and I look back and say, man, I wish I'd have taken them fishing, or I wish I'd have done this. I've got to do that now. And it's incumbent upon us, husbands, wives, uncles, whomever you are, it's incumbent upon us to get those kids on that creek bank, or in that boat, or in the woods. And look, it doesn't have to be deer hunting. It can be, whatever that kid loves. I've got three kids, and they all kind of have different interests. One of them, if he has a passion for squirrel hunting, guess what? We're going to squirrel hunt. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be. I don't have to make him a deer hunter. I just want him to be in the outdoors, and I want him to have that connection like I did. And we spent a lot of time talking about kids, but I just came out of a meeting before I came in here where we were talking about adults as well. We need to get adults involved, because they're much more apt to take their nephew or kid or whomever it may be, or kid at church, whatever. Mm-hmm. They're much more apt to get them to take a kid than, I can get a kid and take him hunting for a day or whatever. But when I'm away from him, he's got to convince his mom or dad or aunt, uncle, whomever, to take him back or take her back. Yeah. But if I can get that adult involved, and they're like, wow, this is awesome, I want to do this, then they can take a kid with them. Right. So however we do it, it's just important for us that have that connection, that have that love for it, and see the just how much it means to us and what it means for conservation in the future, to get whomever it is involved. Yeah. And you look at our state, the state of Mississippi, geographically, from a population standpoint, I would think, and I wonder how you would speak to this. I would think that when you look at what you're trying to do and what your staff are trying to do, what we're talking about, future conservation, preservation, keep it going, everything. You look at the state of Mississippi and where it is right now, it has everything. And I don't know that you could find a better place to be trying to implement programs and get people involved in the outdoors than our state. Yeah. And you're a lifelong Mississippian. I moved here to go to college and have been here ever since. And
I bought enough car tags. So I'm a Mississippian for sure.
That's
but
right.
It's it's easy to brag on where we live. But when I look at it from that standpoint too, a future standpoint, Mississippi is really uniquely positioned, I would think.
Yeah, we're still a rural state, compared to
Very
a lot
much.
of others.
Yeah.
And some people say, well, should we be proud of that? Yeah, I kind of like it. Come here and visit, sure, but we still have that rural connection and that connection to the land, to a certain degree. Now we're moving away from, like I say, you're talking about kids. There's so much that distracts our kids today, but we're still largely connected to the land. But yeah, when you really think about this state and what it has, from the Delta and the river bottoms of the Delta, and the connection to the Mississippi River, to the swamps of where I grew up in Amite County, to some of the remnant prairie ecosystems in Northeast Mississippi, to the coast, and what all those coastal ecosystems and what you can do there. We are a diverse state, and there's so many opportunities. And again, if you just like to hike or whatever, or kayak or whatever it may be, there are so many opportunities in our state, so many things that we can afford you here. And again, I grew up in the swamps of South Mississippi. I may have ventured to the Delta a little bit as a kid, but I really didn't venture into the Delta and spend time in the Delta until I worked here and developed this fascination, if you will, with the Mississippi Delta. And so there is so much out there. So whether you're a lifelong Mississippian or whether you're a transplant or you're just coming here to visit, it really is amazing just what you can find to do here.
When you, in your position, get a chance to, communicate with, citizens, whether it's people who do hunt and fish, whether it's those maybe you're introducing to ideas, whether it's hiking, whatever, what's the message? And for those that are listening now, what's the message to them to, one, if you are involved, here's how you help us and preserve this for children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And if you're not involved, here's why you ought to get out, experience it. Maybe start with hiking, canoeing, whatever. What's your message to those people that are listening?
Yeah. So, for us as an agency, I mean, again, we're funded primarily by hunting and fishing licenses. So the men and women that hunt and fish, but you don't have to be a hunter or an angler to help out with conservation, whether that's financially or just being engaged as a public voice or whatever it may be. But again, I take a lot of pride in this agency. I mean, we've been around for 90 years now, and we were founded to really be the tip of the spear for conservation. And so I'll never shy away from that. I'll always believe that we're the tip of the spear for conservation. And for the critters that need a voice, we're their voice. We're the gatekeepers. Mm-hmm. And so, if you want to be engaged and you want to contribute, you can buy a hunting and fishing license. You don't have to be a hunter or an angler, but you can buy a hunting and fishing license. And those dollars, for every dollar that you contribute with a license, we'll turn that into $4 through our Pittman-Robertson Act or Pittman-Robertson dollars or Dingell-Johnson dollars. We'll turn your $1 into $4, and we'll take those $4 and we're doing fantastic conservation work. So, if you want to pass it on to the next generation, we want you to do that. But we want you to know that our organization, we're not a tax funded agency. We don't get general tax dollars. It's done through license dollars and those excise taxes on guns and ammunition and fishing tackle. And so, if you want to contribute, hey, buy a hunting and fishing licenses or hunting. That's as simple as that, and you can contribute tremendously to conservation.
Mm-hmm. Russ, what's your advice to the young person listening who is having that aha moment that you did as a young person, going, "You mean you can do that for a living?" Yeah. And they want to be in your seat and in your office 25 years from now, and they're either on the fence or they're just getting into it and deciding that's what I want to do. What's your advice to that person who's in school and they want a career like this?
Yeah. So I'll tell them from experience is don't do it the way that I did it. I didn't immerse myself in all that I could. I didn't take every opportunity that I could to, get an internship or go volunteer on a wildlife project or whatever it may be. I was that, you hear a lot about wildlife biologists being introverts. I'm the epitome of the introvert, okay? So I didn't get engaged and involved in all that I could. But fortunately, it didn't cost me in the long run because I'm still able to have a career, and I'm very blessed and fortunate for that and thankful for that. But if you're a high school student or a college student, look for every opportunity to get experience, to hang out with our folks, to go work on a project, whatever it may be. Get out there and get involved. Get your hands dirty. Get all the experience that you can, and even if it, certainly drawing a paycheck's good, but even if you have to work a summer, for free, do what you can do to get that experience. Because when it comes time to actually, send an application or submit an application or send a resume or go to that interview, I can promise you that those folks that are doing the hiring are going to be looking to see, what's on that resume. What did you do? What do you have experience doing? What do you bring to the table? Mm. So if you love it and you want to have a career in it, start right now doing anything you can do to get some experience. Jump in there, volunteer, get your hands dirty, raise your hand and say, hey, I'll be glad to help you. Do what you can because it will pay dividends in the long run.
In terms of the tangible things of, you mentioned taking your own children, but the tangible things that are happening, whether it's events or something like a fishing rodeo that gets them out, what are those activities and kind of what's the approach there?
Yeah, so just some of the things that I've personally been involved with over the years, actually before I had kids and even when my kids were smaller, the church I was involved with, but when we lived in Purvis, we took students kayaking down the Black Creek, and a couple of times we did some overnight, canoe trips. And so it wasn't really hunting or fishing necessarily, but it was in the outdoors. And we took those students and those youth down Black Creek and just got them outdoors, and spent time with them and just engaging with them and being in the outdoors. So now, if you can take a kid squirrel hunting or take a kid fishing, great. But really, just get them in the outdoors doing something. Again, it doesn't always have to be about hunting and fishing. You just want to get them out there in creation and let them experience it, smell it, feel it, touch it, and just expose them to it. So now I've taken kids, hunting. I've taken adults hunting, but it's a matter of getting them. And you can ask them, hey, you may not like hunting and fishing, but hey, would you like to go on a hike or would you like to go on a canoe trip? I went this past summer with a friend of mine and his son, kayaking on Strong River. It was kind of first experience for his son. Had a ball with my kids. We played on the creek bank, and they were more wanting to play on the creek bank than they were kayaking. Bottom line is we were having a big time and having a lot of fun. So just find some kind of some avenue, some outlet to get them in the outdoors.
The word you used, exposing them to it, it makes me think that, you as a kid with your dad, me as a kid with my dad, I didn't have to be convinced to enjoy it and fall in love with the outdoors. All I had to do was be exposed to it, and it happened. Yeah. And I guess that's how it happens, isn't it?
Yeah. My dad always tells a story, and I sort of remember this story, but my daddy it's kind of ironic. My dad was a dentist, but my dad always had plenty of candy or something to go with us hunting. And one day we were hunting. He was sitting actually up in the deer stand, and I wanted to sit on the ground. So he put me down on the ground underneath the deer stand, and he gave me a handful of candy. And he said that should keep him occupied, while we're hunting. And Dad said about 10 minutes later, he hears, "Daddy." He got up, "Daddy." And I was getting a little bit louder with every "daddy." And he finally looked down and said, "What?" I said, "I'm out of candy." He said, "I don't know what you did with that candy. I don't know if you ate it all or what you did with it." He said, "But you were out of candy in about 10 minutes. But my dad was he was trying to get me there, and he was trying to get me, into hunting. And so if he had to give me candy, even though he was a dentist, he wanted me to be out there and be in the outdoors. So, if you gotta, whatever you have to do, of course, we say we want to get them away from electronics. So maybe don't take the iPad with you, but if you give them a pocket full of candy or something, get them out there and spend some time with them.
Yeah. Well, in a few years and a cavity or two here and later, you're still in a deer stand.
Right. Still in a deer stand. Yeah.
That's great. Russ, appreciate what you do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for what you do, and thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. That's Russ Walsh, the Chief of Staff of Wildlife here at Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. Thanks for listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast, and we'll see you outdoors.